Joe Burrow goes down with a calf injury. He's quoted to miss several weeks. Big, little, or no impact.
Well, he's arguably the second or third best player in all of football, certainly the second best player in his position. So I think it's a huge deal for Cincinnati. The question is, and I heard Jamar Chase say the other day, like he said, man, I don't want you coming back to week 5. Like don't rush it. Don't
That's
put yourself in
100%.
a position where you could, compromise yourself in the future. Like calf injuries or one of those calves, hamstrings are like you don't come back until you are 100% ready to go. And so the fact that if this was going to happen, the best time for it to happen is obviously training camp.
Of course.
And so for Cincinnati, the question is whether or not they can tread water. If they can go 2-2 with Trevor Siemian at quarterback, again, we know they have as good of an offensive personnel as there is. Improved offensive line, Joe Mixon, great receivers, a very good defense. Although they did lose both their safeties, which is a concern. But they're a team that's good enough to tread water, going 2-2. But listen, the AFC North is, in my view, maybe this is just me being a biased Steelers fan, but it's probably the toughest division in football.
Definitely.
So you don't want to get off to a rough start. Which look, they started 0-2 last year, and they ended up in the conference title game, won the AFC North. So again, it's all going to be hinged on what the word several means. Again, it happens at the beginning of training camp. I would be stunned if he's available for week 1 against Cleveland, but it's Joe Burrow, so it's a big deal. No question about it.
Yeah, going to double down and say big deal as well. You talk about Trevor Siemian, the guy that's, QB2 on the roster. He would be the one coming in taking snaps. And don't get me wrong, a good enough offensive line for sure. You got Joe Mixon back there. You've got some great offensive talent, but it would be a very simple system that you had probably seen him plug into, maybe a lot like what we saw with the Jimmy Garoppolo or, maybe with Gardner Minshew at times, or even with Brock Purdy, just a very simple cut and dry system. But the coaching, the defense is good enough. The offense is definitely there enough to make it acceptable, like you said, to possibly go 2-2. I didn't look at the schedule, wish I would have, but nonetheless, I know it's going to be a big impact here. Love to see him out there week 1. I have the feeling maybe he could be. We're 4 weeks from today of, being on this live show to where we've got, well, obviously he's not going to be in that game, but on that Sunday, just a few days after, he'll be out there on the field. Now we got Jalen Ramsey, who suffered a training camp injury. He's out until December after he has meniscus surgery, just traded from the LA Rams to the Miami Dolphins. Dolphins got a lot of hype this year coming in, a lot of good defensive players, but Jalen Ramsey out into December, big, little, or no impact.
Believe it or not, I actually think it's kind of a little impact. This is a Dolphins defense that played pretty well at the end of the year. They've got obviously added Bradley Chubb at the trade deadline last year, very good pass rusher. And we forget Xavier Howard's still a very good corner, very productive corner in this league. And he's obviously
rough year, unfortunately.
Coming off a rough year. He says he's looking to, really, shut the doubters up, shut the haters up. And, obviously we consider arguably the biggest outside of, at least in my opinion, Brian Flores getting hired as the DC in Minnesota, fixing what was a horrible defense last year. I think Vic Fangio going to Miami is as big of a coach hiring that isn't a head coach hiring as we've seen in the NFL this past offseason. So I think he'll get that defense to new level. Again, my question about Miami is not, obviously we understand what their offensive talent is. It's the health of Tua, and then when Tua is healthy, is he a quarterback? Because we saw this at the end of the year last year. Is he a quarterback where the more he plays, the more DCs get film on him, the more predictable he becomes, the more limited he ends up getting? But I don't think listen, Jalen Ramsey himself is coming off a rough 2022 campaign. Even the end of the 2021 season when the Rams won the Super Bowl wasn't playing his best football. He got cooked numerous times against Cincinnati by the likes of T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. So that became a little bit of an issue, but I don't think it's near as big of a deal as people think, so I'm going to go little.
I'm going to go little impact as well. Like you said, Jalen Ramsey coming off that kind of subpar for his standard season, of course, with the Rams. He does win that Super Bowl, thankfully, and he's been a corner that I feel like is one of the more controversial ones because some are like, yeah, he's a lockdown, no doubt. Some people won't even put him in the top 5 potentially. It just depends on really who you talk to. I know we both recognize talent. We know he's one of the elite players in this league, but he does have a lot to prove. You could possibly venture towards big, though, because X Howard as well as Xavier Howard coming off of that rough season. And you want to see that defensive culture. Thankfully, they hire Vic Fangio in the offseason, who is really going to be a supplemental part to that defense. We know Sean Payton wanted him for his defense. Obviously, he escapes and goes to the Miami Dolphins, kind of on the likes of a Brian Flores as well, who is with the Minnesota Vikings now. I don't know. I think I'm going to correct and go big here because I know he was a big piece coming over. I know it was to really help supplement because X Howard, of course, did have that little bit of a rough season. I think the tandem of the two of them will help out, but missing until December, I think we're going to see a different defense once Jalen Ramsey comes back, and the numbers will reflect that too. Now, a major fantasy player who absolutely took off when Matthew Stafford got there, they win the Super Bowl together. Cooper Kupp is down with a hamstring injury. LA says it's day to day, not giving too much news, I believe, on what's happening. What say you, though, Bryson?
That's a big deal, and I've always been a Cooper Kupp fan in large part because a good buddy of mine, John Rivera, Fan Perspective Podcast. Shout out to my guy. He called Cooper Kupp my twin. I don't know if there's any resemblance there, but listen, I'll give him love where it's due. But listen, he's
I
been one of
see
the
it a
most.
little bit.
That's what I'm saying. Like he said, I'm like, I sort of see where he's coming from there. But obviously, he had arguably the greatest single season any receiver's ever had a couple of years ago with the Rams. And when you consider LA, which with a team that's again, you talk about earlier with the Colts and Cardinals, how much 18 months can change everything. Rams are a perfect example of that. They're hoisting the Lombardi Trophy to now in a weak NFC. You have a lot of folks that don't even think they're going to make the playoffs,
right?
Despite Stafford coming back and healthier and Cooper Kupp and whatnot. So it's not a very deep Rams roster. Aaron Donald obviously flirting with retirement. So obviously, again, trading Jalen Ramsey was a big one. So losing Cooper Kupp and they lost. I know it didn't work this past season, but Allen Robinson left to go to my Steelers. Like this is you want to talk about being valuable to an offense? He really is the offense because they don't really have much of a running game. The offensive line did not get better in the offseason. So for Matthew Stafford, a quarterback that's getting up there in age, already dealing with a tough offensive line, you'd at least like to have that number one receiver you can go to and have full trust and support him. But it doesn't look like you're going to have that potentially for the near future. So I think it's a very big deal for the Rams.
Yeah, I think it's a major deal too. You see how Cooper Kupp really becomes that vital part of that Rams offense as soon as Matthew Stafford comes over, having arguably the best or at least the second best wide receiver season in NFL history. And the Rams are one of those teams. Shout out Pick a Side Podcast. I actually mentioned this in their latest episode. The Rams are a team that feels like they're one player on both sides of the ball away from going through a rebuild. Like Cooper Kupp, if he went out for the season, it would feel horrible. If Aaron Donald, for some reason, got hurt and was out for the season, now that Jalen Ramsey is gone, it would feel horrible. And of course, you enjoyed when, Bobby Wagner was there. Now he goes back to the, what's it called? Now he goes back to the Seahawks. I want to say did they sign Von Miller, the Rams?
No, Von Miller went to Buffalo.
Okay. Where was he? I feel like he went. Did he not go from the Rams and then sign with Buffalo? Did he?
Yeah. He left after the Super Bowl and then signed that 6-year contract with Buffalo last year.
Okay, so okay, so I'm thinking there was they have another veteran leave from the defense. Matthew Stafford,
Whitworth retired,
come in, right? Whitworth retired, which was huge, legendary offensive lineman, major part for them. So you don't want to see this happen for a team like the Rams. I'm going to say big impact as well, though, because when he's on the field, we know he's one of the most unguardable receivers. And yes, I do think you look a little bit like Cooper Kupp as well. Broncos wide receiver Tim Patrick out for the season. I want to say with a ruptured Achilles, if I'm not mistaken. Might have been an ACL or a meniscus. Can't remember. We know he's out for the season, though. Sean Payton and Russell Wilson will not be able to have him at their disposal. Big, little, or no impact.
I actually think this is a sneaky big deal because Tim Patrick, we forget a couple of years ago, had a very productive season with Teddy Bridgewater quarterback. Obviously, the Broncos didn't have the highest hopes that season, but we have Sean Payton coming in, and the receivers that he's obviously with Drew Brees back in New Orleans was able to really get the best out of. I think you consider Denver. I know they have Jerry Jeudy, but has he at any stage of his career really gotten to that level we thought he would get to coming out of Alabama, arguably the best receiver in college football at that time? So and you could say, well, what about the quarterback? Well, Garrett Wilson dealt with 4 quarterbacks last year and was undeniably one of the 10 best receivers in the sport. So that's something I worry about. I worry a little bit about their tight end unit now. Listen, I don't think this is going to be a death nail to Denver's playoff hopes, but it's definitely a ding. So I think it's much closer to a bigger deal than it is a little deal.
Yeah. I don't know if I would be willing to lean big deal, but I do know what you mean about the contributions that Tim Patrick has had. And shout out to him the last couple years. I didn't even know he missed apparently all of 2022.
Yeah, he's dealt with some bad injury luck.
Yeah, I think he came back from, and I figured out this happens sometimes between athletes. It can be on the same leg. They'll come back from the ACL, and I guess because the Achilles might be overcompensating for the healing ACL, boom, they turn around and rupture the Achilles. You've seen it in baseball, basketball, football. Definitely unfortunate. I am going to go little impact because we know that I at least feel like I know they drafted a receiver, if I'm not mistaken. We know that there's Jerry Jeudy as
Mhm.
well. I think Jerry Jeudy might really have an actual breakout season, be able to get to that 1,300 yard receiver. We know he's dealt with some injuries too, though. I want to say in his sophomore year, that really didn't help him out. His rookie year and last year were pretty solid. So I'm hoping with Russell Wilson and Sean Payton that he'll be able to break out more. Tim Patrick would be a guy that if he was there, 6, maybe 7, 800 yards, depending on how he's plugged in, maybe even 1,000 yard receiver. Not too much of an impact, though, in my opinion, for me to go big. Now, the Falcons signed Jeff Okudah, former, I think, number 4 overall pick that went to the Lions. They
Third.
pick
I
him
think it was the
up.
third.
Yeah, 3rd overall pick, excuse me. That was for the Lions. Now he is with the Atlanta Falcons. Had some injury history. He goes down with a leg injury. He could miss up to the first 3 weeks of the season. What do you think?
Well, given that it's only the first 3 weeks of the season, I think it's a little deal. And if it was like he was out for the season like a Tim Patrick or something, I think it'd be a huge deal. Atlanta over the last half decade has had massive struggles defensively. We talk about obviously their talent offensively. The question is, can Desmond Ridder, produce given the guys he's got around him, starting with Drake London? But listen, defensively, they've really struggled over the last few years. They've struggled to put together a consistent secondary. Their pass rush has really been not much to speak of outside of Grady Jarrett. So they've really struggled in that regard. They've tried to address the corner position in recent years in the draft, but they've really never been able to kind of be able to hash that out. So they bring in a guy who was the number 3 overall pick back in 2020, and now he's out to the first 3 weeks of the season. I'll say little, but if it drags out, this could be a big deal for Atlanta given their defensive struggles.
Agreed. Could definitely go towards a big part because they've done so much of that rebuilding in the offseason. And I even said it. I was on record. It's ironically my best video on the YouTube channel is I think the Falcons will have a top 10 defense going into next year when you look at everybody they signed, all the players that they brought in, knowing that they've been trying to turn it around big time on the defensive side of the football. And who knows, maybe they'll be 12th, maybe they'll be 13th or 14th, but they have all the pieces in place with a Jesse Bates, with a Caden Ellis, bringing over a veteran that's going to give you something, of course, in Calais Campbell. They bring in Bud Dupree. I know there's multiple names that I'm missing there as well. But I think they're going to be in some good hands this year. They also bring in Jeff Okudah. We know he's been injury prone since he's come into the league. If he's healthy, yes, he can be that guy that was the 3rd overall pick. But we don't necessarily know yet. So I'm going to stick with little impact. But if he does miss time longer, or if for some reason we can assume he was going to be that type of player, then yes, we could bump that impact up. Now, Zach Moss breaks his arm and will miss the rest of training camp. Going back to the Indianapolis Colts here, I don't know the gentleman's name that's in first on the depth chart, but it's not a name that I believe anybody is going to be remembering as we think about the Colts this year. All respect to him, Zach Moss, and Jonathan Taylor. Big, little, or no impact for Zach Moss and the Colts.
Big deal, just not because it's Zach Moss, because this is sort of, I don't believe in NFL gods necessarily, but there are some times where you have all these Jonathan Taylor news, and all of a sudden the number 1 running back of the depth chart breaks his arm, and it's like, well, this is maybe a sign like, guys, you probably need to get something worked out with Jonathan Taylor. Again, we know there's a disconnect between the front office and his agent, as we talked about earlier in your show. But I think it's a big deal for that reason. Like, if they don't sign Jonathan Taylor, man, they don't have anything to work with in the running game other than Anthony Richardson, if he even starts week 1. So they're in a bad spot in that regard.
Yeah, going to say big deal as well because of the way the Jonathan Taylor situation is going. You want, even though Zach Moss isn't, super regarded or really respected because he wasn't necessarily handed the reins and just really didn't have, I feel like, that part of an offense to really be able to get plugged into and actually get his reps and get his yardage and his snaps and everything up. So it is going to be important because, with the running back one that's on the depth chart now, it's going to be clearly a fall off from Jonathan Taylor. We saw that when Jonathan Taylor's not that focal point, what can happen with the record, the team, and the offense. Hometown player, Saints guard Trey Turner, who they literally sign moments, it felt like, before this happened, tears his quad, out for the season. Saints have been a team that, I hear some podcasts saying, oh, the Saints O-line is great. It's good. It's what it's always been. It's probably the worst Saints offensive line in a decade, if I'm being honest, based on the draft, how injuries are rolling out, Trevor Penning making me really nervous. I'm not the biggest fans of some other guys that we have out there. Like, I really only trust Ramczyk at the end of the day. Hated to see Teron Armstead leave. I hate that Andrews Pete cannot stay healthy as he was once, a very healthy player for us. Big, little, or no impact for New Orleans.
Because of the reasons that you just mentioned, the lack of depth, I think it's a big deal. And you consider the fact that this is a. I'm glad you brought up the fact that they've been struggling a little bit in that regard, because obviously losing Teron Armstead to the Dolphins a year ago, I
Yeah.
remember was like one of the bigger free agent deals that nobody was really talking about.
Yeah.
And obviously he's been huge for Tua there.
Oh
But I
yeah.
think this is a big deal. Obviously, there's the old saying that I've talked about in my show before, that offensive lines are like the air conditioned system, like you only notice it when it's not working.
Yep.
And so when you have a Derek Carr, who's a veteran quarterback, and some great, young wide receivers led by a guy I love, Chris Olave,
Yep.
it doesn't. Chris Olave can't get the ball if Derek Carr's on his butt the whole game. So that's obviously an issue, and obviously for the
Right.
running game, once we'll talk about Alvin Kamara when he gets back, is going to be a big loss for him. So sucks for Trey Turner, sucks for the Saints. I think this is a big deal.
Yeah, I think it's a big deal as well because you want to see the Saints have that consistency in their O-line, bringing in Derek Carr, understanding that some of the guys that are behind him on the depth chart, and the Saints always having a solid O-line helped with a good run game, helped with a good play action game, screen game, passing game. Breeze was a big timing quarterback in that system, and we'll see a big difference and much less of that with a Dennis Allen and Derek Carr, but it always is going to come back to your offensive line. And I was excited when we signed Trey Turner. I was like, great. I know he's not going to be a very, elite guy or maybe even a great guy, but it'll be good. He'll be rotational. I feel like I'll be able to trust him, tears the quad, out for the season. Big impact, no doubt. Last one here before we get into the break. All three Seahawks running backs are currently injured. Kenny McIntosh, rookie out of Georgia, Zach Carbonet, rookie out of UCLA, and also Kenneth Walker, who is turning into a star running back before our eyes. Great rookie campaign. Big, little, or no impact for this final training camp injury.
I think it's big. I must sound like the biggest alarmist here. Everything's big. Everything's, but I
They
just
got some
think
good ones though.
it is. No, there's some big injuries starting with Burrow. No, I think it's a big deal for Seattle, given, and look, people talk about, hey, Geno's coming off this comeback player of the year season. They just added the kid out of Ohio State. I'm forgetting his name at the moment. They just added the wide receiver there.
Oh, JSN.
Yeah, Jason Jackson Smith and Jigba, adding him to Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, looking to have a big year. Should have, by the way, been in the top 100 players. DK should have been. But
Yeah, kind of wild.
it was very wild. But listen, Seattle, even back when Russell was in his absolute peak of his powers, they were a
Yeah.
run first team. Obviously, remember back in the day with beast mode, and even now last year, Kenneth Walker, as you mentioned, had an excellent rookie season, has a ton
Yep.
of upside as a prospect and now as a player. So this could be something that plays Seattle. And obviously, listen, the expectations are much greater than they were a year ago. A lot of folks thought that last year they'd be not necessarily in tank mode, but in like a soft
Right.
tank kind of. Geno's like that transition quarterback for a guy to eventually
Mhm.
draft, and they shocked everybody, made the playoffs, and so they're looking to build off of that. Losing those three guys is definitely going to hurt them.
Yeah. Yeah, it is going to be a major impact there because when you look at how Kenneth Walker was playing out with things, when you look at they bring in Kenny McIntosh, who was a solid running back from Georgia. When you
Yep.
look at Zach Carbonet, who was up there in those running back rankings as well, to be able to make an impact coming out of college, going to Seattle, who is a team, that really is trying to turn into that pass first team, but they were for a while, and a reason why Russell Wilson left because they were a run first team. And you look at the running back room, that's what made me really think Seattle was going. With that, Seattle was a winner of the draft. Also, their top pick and Devon
Yeah.
Witherspoon is out with an injury as well. I think he's going to be okay to get back in the first of the season. Apparently, Pete Carroll says it's a different hamstring injury, if I'm not mistaken. But back to the Seahawks running backs, yes, I do think that's going to be a big impact because of, again, how we've seen Kenneth Walker perform in just the rookie year, and he's even getting top 10 rankings from places like PFF, other power rankings out there. Kenny
Yep.
McIntosh and Carbonet coming out of UCLA. It's going to be big, and you don't want those three pieces, really the whole running back room, before they start to have to go, cherry pick from free agents, practice squads, whatever the case may be. So definitely a big impact there for the Seattle